It's ironic, I think, that although Churchill never thinks of it in this way and never writes about it in this way, Hitler is the man who most of all is responsible for Churchill's finest hour.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Times Radio History Myth-Busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment from history and historical figure or a piece of equipment, and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some things that people get wrong, and we'll also cover a few things you may not know. Today is the turn of one of the most influential figures of the Second World War, and one of the most recognisable faces of the 20th century, Winston Churchill. Joining me for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to have Professor David Reynolds, Emeritus Professor of International History at Christ College, Cambridge, and author of Mirrors of Greatness, Churchill and the Leaders Who Shaped Him. David, welcome to Times Radio History.
It's very good to be with you, James. Thanks.
Now, we should say your book is out now in paperback, and it is worth saying you are one of Britain's foremost experts on Winston Churchill. What is it about the great man that fascinates you so much?
I call him a hardy perennial. You know, this is a man who was born 150 years ago. It'll be November the 30th will be his 150th birthday, if you like. And he's still talked about, whereas a great many Victorians have disappeared into the mists of time. And I think that's partly to do with his role in the Second World War, but also because he is such a versatile character. He's fascinating. You know, this is a man who, yes, was a soldier in his youth. He was a politician, a statesman, but then he was a painter. He was an author. He made his money by writing. It's been estimated maybe 6 million words of writing. That's quite a lot. And he was a bricklayer. He was, you know, all sorts of things. And if we think of many of the, let's be frank, rather monochrome statesmen or politicians we've got in our own day, that versatility, I think, is part of what's fascinating. And of course, a career of that sort means a lot of controversy as well. So this is somebody who is talked about in, you know, laudatory terms in many parts of the world and questioning ones in others. And so, you know, he's somebody to talk about. That's undoubtedly the case.
And I suppose,
larger than life.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose, given the length of his career, and as you say, David, the breadth of it, and the, you know, the range of things he did, the range of passions and interests he had, it is inevitable that myths will develop about Churchill. Now, we'll come on to your myths in a moment, but you have a kind of slightly different take on how we define myths or what the meaning of myths is. And you would say with most myths, there's always a shred of truth.
There may well be. Otherwise, it would perhaps have just been completely blown away right at the beginning. So what's interesting, I think, is the way that myths have something there, but sometimes it's been grossly exaggerated or misleadingly distorted. And what we've got to do is to probe those. And one of the challenges, I think, of biography is that tendency, because you're putting the person center stage, you almost blow up his or her character and achievements, because that's the point of the book. And then, of course, you can turn it all around and say, oh, this person was not a genius, was not an amazing hero. This person was a villain. You know, it's either good or bad. And I think that's part of what's happened with Churchill quite often, that things have been picked out in a way out of context. And I'm a historian, not a biographer. I'm interested in setting a human being in the larger context of history and of developments that that person sometimes controlled and sometimes could not.
Well, let's get into the 5 Churchill myths you've kindly chosen for us, David. And the first one goes right back to Churchill's childhood. Did he do badly at school?
Well, there's a wonderful book called My Early Life that he published in 1930. And it's sometimes been taken sort of seriously as a straight piece of writing. I have a feeling this is what we might call a piece of creative writing. He's trying it on a little bit. He adopts different voices at different times in the book. So there's a sort of voice that is almost the young schoolboy. There's a voice that's a young soldier. And then he ends by saying, you know, he got married and lived happily ever after. 1930, there's an awful lot more to happen. So what he was interesting there, I think, is that he really plays up this idea that he was, you know, he did badly at school, and his father was writing him damning letters about how he will be a complete failure if he doesn't pull himself together, and so on. You know, there's wonderful sort of passages. He can't stand studying Latin. So he asks his teacher, why does the word mensa mean table or O table? And the teacher, in exasperation, said, well, you'd say O mensa if you were addressing the table. But I don't address tables. If you say things like that, you will be severely punished. You know, this sort of thing, playing around it. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. The point about Churchill is that basically, if he didn't think something was worth studying, he didn't put his effort into it. But on things, so Latin and Greek was very much in that category. But if he wanted to study something, he saw a meaning in it, then he would work really hard. He had a formidable memory. He loved history. He loved poetry. He could learn hundreds of lines of poetry by heart. And also, I think, you know, because he never, dare I say this, I'm a professor, but he didn't go to university. He didn't get pigeonholed into a particular intellectual compartment. He didn't study classics or philosophy or whatever. He was a very fertile mind. He loved science fiction. He got into, he was fascinated by gadgets. And I suspect that this is part of why he's, you know, he's the sort of person who seizes on ideas like the tank in the First World War, or in the Second World War. He's the kind of person who sees immediately the value of signals intelligence, of intercepting German cables, Axis cables. And he's the man who puts a huge amount of money into Bletchley Park, the code breakers. Now, that sort of thing, I think, is indicative of a man who's got a very, very sharp, fertile mind, even if he didn't do awfully well at Latin and Greek at school.
I mean, you wonder if there's an element, David, of Churchill deliberately kind of perpetuating his own mythology about maybe not being so academically gifted,
yes,
in order to make himself look more impressive down the line, that he was able to rise to such heights despite not necessarily being as academically gifted as some of his peers.
That's right. And I think when he started getting lots of honorary degrees from universities after the Second World War, that was pretty much the line he said, you know, look at me, you know, disaster at school and so on, and now I'm all getting all these things, and of course eventually Nobel Prize for Literature and things like that. So yeah, Churchill was a man whose almost part of his style was to exaggerate. Hyperbole, you know, you didn't just put it flat, you put it in striking colors, and that was the way you got attention. And sometimes that worked very well, sometimes it kind of bounced back on him and to his own, to create some problems. But, you know, that's part of the color of the man.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I heard a story, I think from one of my history teachers at school, and this might be nonsense, this might be part of the mythology itself, David, that he was once in an exam and he didn't have anything to write, so during the entire exam he just wrote his name or something. Have you heard that story?
Yes, that's right, yes. And then I think after a while he put down the number of a question, 1, and then I think maybe either put a full stop after it or brackets after due consideration. That's part of one of the stories in my early life, that book I've just mentioned. You know, and it strikes you. And in a way that if you think of him in that sort of way, schoolboy failure and then absolutely dramatic success in later life, that adds to his achievement. But as I say, there's an element of fun here. And this is this is a character who actually loves fun. He really doesn't like anything particularly boring or people that are boring. He just loves, his ideal is to have a really good dinner party with good food and definitely good wine and really good conversation. And that's lively, it's spirited, it's kicking things around. That's part of his fun. And of course, he will make sure in that conversation that he does an awful lot of the talking. So he's, that's the character.
And do we almost see an echo of his school days in his later career, in the sense that what he was good at, whether it was history or English, he was very good at. What he was less good at, the classics, he was very uninterested in. Could you say the same with sort of certain topics later on in his career and when he was a leader?
Yes, I think you can up to a point, but of course, the real test for him is the wartime prime ministership. You can't focus on everything. And Churchill has an eye for what's important. So, for example, one of the first things he does in 1940, in May 1940, is to make himself Minister of Defence. Now, there is no Ministry of Defence in 1940. There won't be until the 1960s. What Churchill wants is to be able to deal directly with the chiefs of staff, the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, in terms of strategy. Doesn't want to have to deal with any other politicians. And that's a lesson he's learned from the First World War about the problems if you don't have direct access as leader to those people. Other aspects, so for example, the home front, particularly in the once the Second World War gets going, and it's a coalition government with the Labour Party playing a major role, Churchill is quite happy to pass that over to the the party leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee. And Attlee is a very loyal deputy, and he works really hard. But Attlee also sees the ways in which 5 years in government for him and his colleagues will prepare them to take over if they win the next election. And that indeed is what's happened. So the people who are schooled in the war, in domestic policy particularly, are the ones who form the Labour government from 45 to 51, which is one of the most significant in 20th century British history. So you can see there that some people might say, well, Churchill took his eye off the ball in terms of domestic policy, and socialism was creeping along under the surface during the war, which it was. War socialism was a feature, in a sense, of the war. It had to be, of the conflict. But here's a man who has his eye on what he thinks matters, and that, I think, is the striking thing.
Well, let's move on to Churchill myth number 2 now, David. And a lot of people in Britain and around the world naturally put Winston Churchill on a pedestal. But your second myth looks at the idea that he was some kind of standalone genius. Is it unfair to describe him as a standalone genius?
Well, this is a kind of example of my yes, but, or no, but kind of reaction to the notion of myths. So, and one of the lines that I quote in Mirrors of Greatness, and we also talk about in Creating Churchill, which is a series of podcasts I've done in connection with the book, is this line by Herbert Asquith, who was Prime Minister at the beginning of the First World War, Liberal Prime Minister. And he talks of Churchill as, says, a wonderful creature with a curious dash of schoolboy simplicity, and what someone said of genius, a zigzag streak of lightning through the brain. A zigzag streak of lightning through the brain. And the word genius is used by several of his contemporaries. That is something they are really struck by. They have no problem using that word. But I also like that sense of schoolboy simplicity or schoolboy fun. That's part of the Churchill story. So, yes, this is a man who, to his contemporaries, not just to us later on or to later generations, is somebody who really stands out as something remarkable. But What I believe quite strongly is that Churchill's career was also so shaped by the people he engaged with. And that, after all, is true for any of us. I mean, if you think back over your career and so on, I do over mine. There's people who really helped us as mentors. There's people who got in our way and infuriated us, whatever. And Churchill's like that on a global scale. So he's got mentors like Lloyd George, the Liberal leader. This is Churchill, changes parties in his early life. He moves from Tory to Liberal. Lloyd George is his great mentor, helps bring him into politics, teaches him a lot about government and about the handling of business. He's got people who are rivals, like Neville Chamberlain in the 1930s. They were both vying to become prime minister. And then he's got people abroad, Franklin Roosevelt, who becomes a great ally, and Churchill works to cultivate him in the Second World War, hugely important. And then he's got enemies, and probably obviously the most significant is Hitler. And it's ironic, I think, that although Churchill never thinks of it in this way and never writes about it in this way, Hitler is the man who most of all is responsible for Churchill's finest hour. In other words, the German decision, approved and encouraged by Hitler, to change their strategy in May 1940 from going straight into Holland and Belgium and having an encounter battle with the French and British armies in Belgium. He changes that to going round the side through the Ardennes, going round the flank of the French and British armies, and then cutting across the Meuse River, going to the Channel. That nearly won, that defeated France in a matter of weeks. And it meant that now Britain was effectively alone in terms of major allies. That was the scene setting for the drama of Churchill's finest hour. So I think we need to think about Churchill in that way as well, how he dealt with other leaders, politicians at home, politicians abroad. That's part of what shaped his career and his experience. So genius, yes, a man of remarkable talent, yes, but let's explore him in interaction with the other people on the stage of history at the time to get a clearer sense of the story that we need to tell.
I mean, that's such an interesting point you raised there, David, about the extent to which the fame that Churchill now has is linked to the actions of Adolf Hitler and the fact that Adolf Hitler ever rose to power in Germany. Are we saying almost that had he not risen to power in Germany, you and I would not be having this conversation about Winston Churchill now? To the extent that we might, it would be he was a relatively unsuccessful chancellor and he was a minister in the First World War government for a time. Right.
Well, you're making an absolutely huge leap here, James, and I just have to tick you off as a professor.
Go for it. Yeah, tick me off.
No, I mean, what is so fascinating, the book is Mirrors of Greatness, and it's really a reflection on what makes leaders great or considered to be great. Churchill's absolutely clear that Hitler doesn't deserve any comment at all. In parts of his memoirs later on, he does write some abusive comments about Hitler, but he doesn't even credit him with any particular tactical skills. Whereas Mussolini, who is hardly, we would think, in the same caliber now, is somebody that Churchill regards as a great leader who just went wrong. But there's no mark of greatness in Hitler at all, as far as Churchill's concerned. And indeed, I think his view of him is that he's a gangster. He's a kind of Al Capone figure. And in fact, when the cabinet were talking about what to do with Hitler, this was in the middle of the war, when they finally caught him, Churchill said that really that he should be summarily executed. We shouldn't have some long trial like the Americans wanted, what happened at Nuremberg. He said, we need to deal with him the way that the Americans deal with gangsters. And maybe we can get an electric chair from the US government courtesy of Lend-Lease, So this is a man who is a complete gutter snipe as far as Churchill's concerned. Yet he made possible, ironically, the moment that Churchill could really stand on the stage. And you ask about how we would have written about him in different circumstances. There is an interesting book that was published in 1970 by the historian Robert Rhodes James. And it's about Churchill from 1900 to 1939, so before the Second World War, up to the Second World War, and it's called Churchill, A Study in Failure, A Study in Failure. And in fact, I think it's an interesting question, you know, with what we could do, and I've done it sometimes with students, you know, say, okay, right, we take this particular historical figure, let's write his obituary at this particular date and see, you know, how would you write about it? And Robert Rhodes James is effectively doing that. He's saying if Churchill had popped it in 1939 or whatever, he would have been regarded, yes, as a sort of genius that never really came off, remarkable character, because certainly all through the 1930s, he's out of office, and there's a lot of people who say, right, well, you know, Winston's had his chance. It was, you know, striking while it lasted, but it's a kind of meteor that burns bright and then disappears, rather like his father's story back in the 1880s, you know. So the question's an interesting one. Certainly, what you have to say is that when he finally gets the moment to stand as Britain's leader, to become Britain's leader, it's at a moment where he is somebody who can rise to that challenge. And I think many politicians need a favorable moment to make their impact on the stage. And many people of talent have never had that particularly favorable moment. Churchill's great fortune, and he said almost it's an act of providence, was that he got that opportunity in May 1940, and he felt his whole life had been a preparation for that hour.
Well, let's move on now to your third Churchill myth. And this covers something we've spoken about on the channel previously, and this is what many sort of see as a blot somehow on Churchill's copybook, and this is his role in the Gallipoli campaign. The kind of myth is that it was a disastrous campaign, which was all his fault. Now, it was a bit of a disastrous campaign, it would seem, but was it all his fault?
Yeah, well, so we got to unpick it again. So we're talking now about 1915, back in the First World War. In the early part of it, the war starts with a very fluid set of battles in August, September 1914, and then it settles down by the end of the year into trenches along the Western Front. And Churchill, like others, is looking for ways of finding some other way to win the war than simply, as he puts it, chewing barbed wire in France, making futile attacks against strongly defended German positions. And one of the ideas is, well, maybe we can knock out one of the major German ally, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, from the war. And Churchill's First Lord of the Admiralty, he sees this as possibly an opportunity for the Navy to win a renown and glory. And what he's proposing is a naval expedition to drive through from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Marmara, which then, if you got across that, would take you right to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the problem is that to get through there, you've got to go through the Straits of the Dardanelles, which are about 40 miles long, I think, something like that, and relatively narrow. So it's a kind of hazardous thing. Churchill is overly optimistic about this being done as a naval operation. And it starts in that way, it doesn't succeed, and then there's a lot of pressure to bring in the army to make it into a much more rounded expedition. And then the landings take place. We then get bogged down on the peninsula in Gallipoli, So it becomes during the course of 1915 a major, and 1916 into 1916 a major disaster. So whose fault is it? Well, Churchill was significantly responsible for the naval operation, which hadn't really been thought through. But he was not responsible for the campaign, the long land campaign, and all the rest of it. And what happened, interestingly, is that the Conservative Party, who by then were brought into a coalition by Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, the Conservative Party had it in for Winston Churchill over the way that, as it was said, he had ratted on the Tory party, ratted on his own, if you like, class allies. He is, after all, the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough, in attacking Tories and the landed aristocracy. So they have it in for him. He becomes, if you like, the sole or scapegoat for the whole thing, whereas in fact he was partly to blame, but others were responsible as well. What's interesting, if you fast forward to the Second World War, to Norway, the Norway campaign in 1940, the attempt to preempt the German occupation of Norway, Churchill he's back at First Lord of the Admiralty again. Then this is the spring of 1940, before he becomes Prime Minister, and there's certainly a lot of reason, if people really went for him at that point, to blame him, to make him the scapegoat. But the Labour Party and the dissident Tories don't go for Churchill. They go for Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister. They want to get him out. And so what you're seeing here is not as it were, a thoughtful distribution of responsibility. It's a political blame game. Churchill comes off really badly in the First World War, and he was pretty lucky, as he privately admitted, and his wife admitted, in the Second World War. But that's how the story goes. The other thing to say here is that Churchill's instinct, I think, is right. What needs to be done is to get away from the Western Front and the huge carnage of those battles, the Battle of Loos, the Somme, Passchendaele in 1915, 16, 17, where there are catastrophic losses. And Churchill's line in 1916 onwards is to say, go on the defensive on the Western Front, let the Germans do the attacking, let them lose the soldiers and so on. And we concentrate on a sort of peripheral strategy, looking for weak links in the German lines and so on. And that, of course, is exactly the strategy that he adopts as Prime Minister in the Second World War. In other words, saying, no, we are not going to do a suicide mission and cross the Channel in 1942 or 43. We are going to attack the soft underbelly of the Axis in the Mediterranean, so it's North Africa and Italy, weaken the Axis that way, and then cross the Channel in strength when we're ready to do it. So there's a certain pattern here which you can see in Churchill learning from his past experiences, because he's done one war and takes over the lessons, positive and negative, into the second one.
It's a very good point you raise about whether the Gallipoli campaign was the right idea but just badly executed. I know we did a whole episode on History Undone about the Gallipoli campaign, and we explored that idea. And I suppose in a way it's inevitable that, you know, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He was duty-bound to take some responsibility for it. But given the politics of the time, as you've explained, David, he was just being scapegoated.
Well, the Tories really had it in for him. And that was very clear to Winston. It was clear to his wife, and their correspondence on this is very interesting. You know, he was really he was surprised in a way that Clementine was not, by the sheer sort of visceral hatred that many Tories had for him. You know, the the judgment on the strategy and the policy has got to include an understanding of what were the sheer naked politics of the time. And I think actually, if you know, for anybody who like us who's now lived through the politics of Brexit over what 5 prime ministers, Tory prime ministers, you can understand the degree of backstabbing that actually does go on in political life. It was, you know, that's what happened in the last few years is not by any means a novelty. And Churchill's own experience in the First World War is an example of that kind of thing.
Indeed, some things never change. Politicians will always gun for each other. Let's move on to your penultimate myth now, David. This is quite a controversial one. It's something that's been reassessed a lot in the last few years in particular. Was Churchill a racist?
Churchill viewed other countries through racial categories. And when I was writing Mirrors of Greatness, I was struck that when he looked at a foreign leader, he had at the back of his mind a particular stereotype of that country. So he gives Mussolini the benefit of the doubt, if you like, because of his admiration, Churchill's admiration for ancient Rome as a great country, as a great civilization. His view of Germany, I think, is colored by the feeling that Bismarck invented something out of a mishmash of territories, and that the Germans at root are a bunch of barbaric tribes whose main interest is in expansion, aggression, and militarism. And that colors him. Now, in the case of India, he's quite clear in his mind that India should not be given self-government. So he is at odds with others in the Tory party of the 1930s, like Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister, at odds with Attlee, who becomes the Labour prime minister after 1945, who believe that essentially what has happened already to Australia, New Zealand, and so on. In other words, that they've moved to dominion status, that was the word used, and then to independence. That narrative, they believe, should apply to, in due course, that progression should apply to India. And Churchill says, no, they are not fit for self-government. That is an absolute in his view. If you look more closely, Churchill has considerable admiration for certain racial groups within the Raj, within the British Raj in India. So, for example, Muslims and Sikhs he regards as, quote, martial races, warlike figures, warlike men who are, of course, the bastion of the British Army, the Indian Army, Britain's Indian Army, who were so important in the Near East in the First World War and the Second. So those are, as it were, those racial categories are good. But what he really dislikes is Hindus. And Gandhi is the epitome of everything that he detests about, if you like, about Hinduism. So Gandhi is a pacifist. Churchill has no time for pacifists, particularly in a war of the dimensions of the Second World War. Churchill is a soldier trained at Sandhurst and so on. So pacifism is a no-go as far as it's credible. It's stupid as far as Churchill's concerned. Gandhi also has a belief that the future of India is not to become an industrialized country and to develop in the way that the West had, but actually to go back to peasant agriculture, to craft industries, spinning. Gandhi does his own spinning, for example, of weaving and so on, simple industries, craft industries. And then, of course, Gandhi is dead against the British Empire. And you have that famous line from Churchill, a speech in the early 1930s, where he talks about Gandhi as a half-naked fakir marching in to address the Viceroy of India, the representative of the King Emperor, on an equal footing. Now, fakir is, of course, very clever because it's a pun. It's F-A-K-I-R, so it's a fakir of the sort that you come across in Eastern mythologies and so on. But of course, you could easily just say it's faker, F-A-K-E-R. And basically, that's what Churchill feels about Gandhi. He's a con man. He's a con man. And what really gets Churchill is that Gandhi is attacking the basic principle of the British Empire, not just the empire itself, but the idea that the point of the empire, as far as Churchill's concerned, is to help move people from barbarism to civilization. And what Gandhi's doing, Churchill feels, is exactly the opposite. He's going to take a country which the British have started to civilize and put them back into barbarism, primitiveness. So it's a very, Gandhi, every strike is against Gandhi as far as Churchill's concerned. He's a complete anathema. And it's not surprising that you really sense a hatred of Gandhi, which is comparable to a hatred of Hitler.
Would it be fair to say, David, that Churchill believed in racial hierarchy?
Yes, I think racial categories and racial hierarchies, and certainly I think he did believe that the destiny of the white peoples was to act as rulers. He did have a keen sense of fair play in certain ways. I mean, he was, for example, a vehement critic of the Amritsar massacre in 1919, where British troops just sprayed bullets around a protest in the city of Amritsar, and he said that's a kind of brutality which is not a mark of the British Empire. But if you take one of the things that's now been hugely held against him, which was the famine in Bengal in 1943-44, Churchill, that's an example, I think, of where, again, biography or a biographical approach has its limits. That famine was caused by essentially the Japanese occupation of Burma and therefore cutting off India's main supplies of rice. It was exacerbated by floods and natural disasters. And then also, and you have to say this, Churchill's eye was not on India then. Obviously, this is not an eye that's particularly favorable to India at the best of times. But in 1943-44, everything he's concerned about is the build-up for D-Day. Building up of troops and supplies in Western Europe for that fateful cross-channel crossing, and so India simply does not get the attention that it deserves and the tragedy that it needs to be addressed. And it's striking that Wavell, who is the Viceroy of India, and so on the spot, he says in his diary that that famine is one of the greatest disasters that has befallen any people under British rule, and that Wavell judges that the damage to our reputation, both among Indians and foreigners in India, is incalculable. So, this is a complicated story and one that is a shocking story in terms of the larger history of the British Empire. But it reflects Churchill's priorities, and it reflects his tendency to think in terms of racial categories, even if he is not solely responsible for that loss of life.
And just finally on this issue, David, of Churchill and race, I mean, it's always a minefield if you try to apply modern day standards to figures from history. We've got to remember the context in which they were living and the attitudes of the time. How would you put his views on race into context? How much emphasis do you think we should place on it today?
Okay, well, I would make a simple comparison, and indeed this is what I do in Mirrors of Greatness, because there is a chapter on Attlee, Churchill and Attlee. Attlee is a Victorian, like Churchill. It's often said, oh, well, you know, they were all Victorians. That's how they viewed India in those days. Actually had a totally different view. Attlee was about a decade younger than Churchill, but he was born in the 1880s. He visited India twice for long periods of time in 1928-29 as part of a parliamentary delegation to try and see what could be done about moving India on towards dominion status and independence. And Attlee firmly came to the view that the Indians were capable of home rule. It needed to be handled carefully and moved on to independence, but that was perfectly possible. Attlee's a Victorian, Churchill's a Victorian. Their views on India are totally different. Churchill never set foot in India after the 1890s. He was there as a young soldier, but his views are very much stuck in a particular framework. So I wouldn't say that you know, everybody in Britain had those same views. You need to look around, and the Attlee-Churchill comparison, I think, is an instructive one.
Just finally, David, let's move on to your final myth about Churchill. And this seems a fitting place to end. Kind of the image that we have of Churchill today, and this is the sense that he was a bulldog. He had bulldog-like courage. Is that a fair way of characterising him? I mean, there are even TV adverts in this country with a bulldog named Churchill. It's kind of become the defining image. Is that fair?
Well, again, it's the yes, but thing. So if you think of that wonderful photo portrait that was done by the photographer Yusuf Karsh of Ottawa, which really captured Churchill in a determined bulldog way. Karsh said actually that what he was trying to do was get Churchill to take a cigar out of his mouth, and Churchill refused to do so. After he'd been addressing the Canadian Parliament, I think in 1941, and eventually Karsh, in sheer frustration, went over to Churchill. He just pulled the cigar out of Churchill's mouth, and Churchill was so angry and his jaw set, and Karsh took the picture. So you got that wonderful sense of the indomitable jaw. And that's true. There's undoubtedly the case. He rose to the occasion. He was a man of courage. He was able to meet that crisis in a way that nobody else could do. But what I want to stress and again, this was something that came out in the book and in the podcast, is actually, you know, let's just think for a moment. I mean, Churchill, it's not just that Churchill has courage in 1940. Britain has lost its major ally, the ally that mattered for 4 years in the 1914 to 18. The French army had been absolutely essential in holding the Western Front. They've now gone in a matter of weeks. Any sensible person would say, can we get through this? How are we going to do it? And part of the answer is that Britain has already developed in the 1930s some of the things that will enable us to win what Churchill is calling the Battle of Britain. The Battle of France is over, the Battle of Britain has begun. Not least, fast monoplane fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires, linked to the chain home system of radar. Chain home system connected by landlines to reporting to a central place when German planes have been launched from airstrips on the continent. So you get that crucial few minutes of warning that will get the RAF into the air. Now that's something that is already in place. Churchill takes it over, but he's not responsible for it. But even so, even if we get through the Battle of Britain, even if we're not invaded, how are we going to win this war without the French? You have to look for new allies. And what I think is really striking about Churchill in 1940 is, yes, he is a bulldog, but he's also an improviser. This is a man who says, okay, where are we looking now for others, for our allies? he's already cultivating the American president, Franklin Roosevelt. And he works on that in 41, eventually meeting Roosevelt in August 1941, really wooing Roosevelt. And that's the word he uses in private, but wooing the American president and talking up the special relationship, his phrase, with the United States. And then also, this is a man who's been a vehement anti-Bolshevik ever since the Russian Revolution, who now turns on a dime and says, okay, anybody who fights Hitler is our ally. And once Barbarossa happens, once the Germans go into Russia, Churchill is on that same evening giving a broadcast welcoming Russians and promising their British support. And then he goes about trying to build a relationship with Stalin, a personal relationship. And that's the whole point. Churchill believes in personal diplomacy. He doesn't believe in handing it over to, letting it all be done by the Foreign Office. He's the man, he's quite convinced, who can deal with those other big leaders. He's made it to the top of the British state. He's now able, if you like, he's done the Premiership. He's now ready to do, Championship of the League, Champions League, go onto the continent, visit Roosevelt, visit Stalin. And he's, of course, he's the person who does most of the traveling, because Roosevelt's in a wheelchair and Stalin is petrified of flying and actually is pretty wary about going anywhere near the front. He's a coward. So Churchill does all the flying around. In fact, at the Tehran conference in 1943, when there's a photo shoot of the big three, somebody says, oh, they look like the Holy Trinity. And when that's translated to Stalin, he says, well, if we are Holy Trinity, then Churchill, is Holy Ghost, because he flies around so much. Now, I would say that is a remarkable side of leadership. So that we don't entirely appreciate, because of course now the narrative is so familiar. Oh yes, fall of France, then America, Russia. Actually, Churchill, the improviser, is part of what is striking to me about 1940, and we need to appreciate that more, as well as his courage in the extremities of the fall of France.
David, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us and taking us through those 5 myths. Just before you go, we always like to ask our guests to give us one true fact that maybe is lesser known that you want more people to be aware of. So what have you got for us?
Winston Churchill loved pigs. Okay? He loved animals. I mean, he just had all sorts of menagerie at Chartwell. But he's... he has a lot of dogs, cats, things like that. But he is quoted as saying in the 1950s, his private secretary at that time said, Churchill claimed, dogs look up to you, cats look down to you. Give me a pig. He looks you in the eye and treats you as an equal. Now, I'm sure you'll get a lot of complaints from all sorts of animal lovers who feel that this has done great injustice to their particular favourite pet. But Churchill loved pigs.
Well, that's a brilliant fact to end on. David, thank you so much. Professor David Reynolds there. And a reminder, David's book is Mirrors of Greatness, Churchill and the Leaders Who Shaped Him. It's available in paperback now. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but we will be back busting more historical myths very soon. If there's anything you would like to see us deconstruct for you, let us know in the comments below. And remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History on YouTube. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.